I I'm looking at the connection of the individual as they apply to the nation state and how much the individual has on that decision of going to war. Because
Hmm.
on that first point here, when seeking to determine the conditions obtaining in the field, those five constant factors, number one is the moral law, and it is described as the causation of people to be in complete accord with their ruler, so that they will
Hmm.
follow him regardless of their lives, undismayed by any danger. So, a huge key component of this is getting the everyday layman on the wagon to support it in whatever capacity they are. If you have opposition at home, you know, even if, especially if it's at a 50-50 opposition, your ability to make those advancements and that those offensive maneuvers are going to be hamstrung to a degree. Because inherently, if you don't have a buy-in for the population, if your conquest isn't going to benefit them, then they're not going to be on board. Ultimately, because warfare results in the death of the strongest men in the population. And so when you put those two armies together, you're sacrificing your top players for either the sovereignty of your nation or for further accumulation of resources. But that's a risk then that the nation is taking by saying, okay, I'm putting my best out there and I hope they win. Typically, the larger the nation state gets, the less empathy, the less connection there is between the ruler and the common person that they're putting into the meat grinder because there's just so many of them. And so while you and I might realize, wait a minute, all the strong men are gone. All of the men that are being raised right now are effeminate because they're being raised by single mothers because all of the men died in the war. And so it takes time as well for you for us to see the repercussions of that. It might take a few decades, a few generations for that. It's not instant necessarily, but I think that's a key component, a key factor is that buy-in on an individual level, on an individual basis to see whether or not the excursion is actually worth putting their skin in the game. And do they have the power to do that? Are they being forced? They have to comply. Like let's say so, Kim Jong Un or Il, or I don't know which one, in North Korea, where they demand you to serve in the military or to be a law-abiding citizen without any room for discourse or you raising your hand and saying, "Hey, I don't think this is right." Now, many times that force works if you have a complete crackdown on the people, but inevitably, eventually, that's going to seep out and it's going to unravel. So the key, whether through propaganda or hopefully and ideally through honesty, which is very hard to come by in warfare, you can get a more natural buy-in and say, wait a minute, we're doing this because there's enemies at the gate and we got to take them out. Um, what do you think on that?
Yeah, I think that all circles around that point. Your book says the moral law. Mine just keeps the word Tao.
Yeah.
Which ruler has the Tao? But the Tao is the thing that causes the people to be fully in accord. And there's going to be so many things that go into that, like what connection do you have with the people? How are you providing for the people? How are their lives? What are they seeing around them? You brought up a question about when the common person thinks one thing and a leader brings us to war, like how does that, what does that mean? How does that go? And it's interesting. I'm reading, what is it? Um, Aristotle's Politics, and he brings up that exact question. He says, and this is even for a small, I mean, obviously not as big a nation as we are, a small city state of that time. Like if a ruler makes a decision and the people don't agree, how can you say that the people, can you say like Athens? Say Athens is being ruled by a tyrant and he makes a decision. Does Athens then, um, is Athens responsible for his decisions or not? And if they revolt and kick out the tyrant, does do they have to honor what he said before that, or are they a new people, even though they're still Athens? So he was wrestling with this exact question. Um, what was that, 2000 plus years ago as well. So it's common to humanity, it seems.
Man, that really hits home. That's kind of the conundrum. That's the rub that we're facing. And at what level is the society culpable for the actions of their leaders? I mean, in a democratic society, you would think that it's all the time, right? Because then the people elected the leaders, and the leaders are therefore a direct representation. But clearly, that's not the case as well, right? There's a lot of foul play involved where people get into positions of power that the population didn't necessarily vote for power. So then you get into some really dicey territory there as well. It's like, especially and I'm not poo-pooing on democracy in this sense, but it's like a revolving door where you have just a cycle of leaders. So there's not necessarily, you can't necessarily pinpoint a specific action on one and say, okay, you're responsible for this. Because by the time that occurs, there's already somebody else in line. It's like rows of shark's teeth that come out. I think, for instance, like Boris Johnson, the former prime minister of the UK, who botched a deal between Russia and Ukraine. I believe it was February 2002, and he botched that, and so he's directly responsible for that. But he's no longer in office, so you can't really hold him in power. He's or hold him accountable. He's on some beach somewhere drinking a martini, as everyone else is suffering from his actions. So that's also a really pertinent point as well. Thank you.
Right. Right. And you brought up the UN, so like that's another step up. Like how much are the people of the individual countries responsible for the actions of the UN, which technically their nation is a part of, right? Like if your leaders are involving themselves in UN and the UN does something, is that something that your country did because you're also a part of the UN, right? So that adds another layer to it. Um, and and then there's the problem nowadays of information, of like even if something is like the will of the people, well, especially when it's something across the globe, I think this is hearsay for my part, but from what I understand, like when I think it was when Russia invaded the Crimea, right? And on this side of the world, we're like, oh, Russia's aggression, blah, blah, blah. And you could have a whole country of people being like, yeah, Russia and aggression, and we have to do something about it, and being behind the legislation pushed in that direction. Because from their point of view, they think Russian aggression, we got to do something about that. But from my understanding, people at the time in that area were like, Crimea has always been part of Russia. Like, this
Right.
is not, this is like, I don't know, the US reasserting claim over New York or whatever. Like it's not a big deal. It's not actually aggression, and the Crimeans want to be Russians or whatever. I'm not saying that's perfect information. I'm pointing out the fact that we don't have perfect information, and especially when we're so distant from it, we can make a decision based on what we think is good information, and then we've put our will in a certain direction, and that may not be the right direction to go. That might not be the right direction to put our will. And it's because of how we're not being informed in the correct way. And then it's like, well, misinformation, but then that becomes a tool. Anyhow, there's so many layers to it where that makes me think more, well, how can we be responsible? But then if you say no one's responsible, then no one's responsible and everyone acts with impunity. So pretty difficult situation.